In it here now, I'm gonna do now, I'm gonna been on here now, who bid $500,000 bid.
Welcome to the Legacy of Agriculture. This program will explore the past, present, and future of agriculture. We'll look at the people, products, and events that have formed its history. And now with today's guest, your host, Chris Bair.
Good morning, everybody. This is Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. Appreciate you joining us on WNAX Radio on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock Central Time. If you can't join us or listen to us at WNAX Radio, you can also reach out and listen to our archive shows at thelegacyofagriculture.com, or you can go into Apple, Spotify, and now YouTube. Almost all of our shows are up on YouTube. There are some exceptions from time to time when the video isn't available, but we're trying to cover a lot of our social media bases. But before we get too far into the show, I want to introduce a returning guest from a radio personality from WNAX, Mr. Jerry Oster. How are you doing, Jerry?
Very good, Chris, and thanks for inviting me back. So I guess it wasn't too bad the first time, huh?
How was Thanksgiving?
It was great. We had family and friends around and stuff, kids, grandkids. We had a full house, so it was great. It was wonderful.
That's great.
Yep.
I want to tell you, and the reason why I have invited Jerry back to be on the show is in the Legacy of Agriculture, I think I'm the guy that gets more out of these shows than anybody does because I learned something.
Yeah.
Almost every show that I do, I walk away from it and go, I didn't know that. Not to say that I know a lot, Jerry. I'm just telling you that I learn a lot from the shows. But the last time we did the show, we got into a lot of the history, the beginning, the inception of WNX, and why WNX was put together and why they became a radio show, which was a great show. You want to talk just a little bit about that? And then I want to roll into some of the stuff that you've prepared.
Well, and that's fine. Yeah, WNAX has a wonderful legacy, and we're now 102 years old. You helped us celebrate our 100th anniversary in 2022, which was wonderful. And the radio station was started kind of as a lark by a company called Dakota Radio Apparatus in downtown Yankton. Al Madsen was the man's name, and he had a business selling radios. Well, they weren't selling, and the problem was there was nothing to listen to. So
there was no AM radio
There was
stations.
no radio anywhere around here at that time in the early 1920s. And so he got the brilliant idea of, well, maybe we put something on the radio, people buy the radio to listen to it. Well, that's how you do business. And so they applied for and got the license in November of 1922. The call letters WNAX were assigned randomly. If you look back in the history, that you can see the random numbers, most of which don't exist anymore, and WNAX is still there. One of the few from 1922 that's still on the air with the same call letters. I think there's just a handful. So the radio station was put on the air to sell radios, basically, and they would be on the air, a couple hours every day. They'd come on in the morning, mid-morning, and then they'd say, well, it's lunchtime, we'll be back after a while. So they'd shut it off and then come back in the afternoon. So it was pretty sporadic in the first couple of years.
Right.
But it was enough of a feature and enough of an attraction that they started to sell some radios and make some business. And then they discovered, okay, we're selling some radios here, and the more we're on the air, the more radios we sell. Again, a business decision. So they continued there, but that's where it started, was as a way to sell radios.
It was a means to an end. It was
right.
It was a way. It was a tool that was used to sell a commodity, is what it was.
Exactly. Yep. And it worked pretty well.
So after WNX was started as an AM radio station right here in the very southern part of South Dakota, which literally you could throw a rock into the Missouri River, which divides us from northeastern Nebraska.
Right.
Is where did it go from there, and why? And explain an information only station, and explain why.
Well, it was a lot of things at first. All radio stations back there did a little bit of everything. They did actually mostly music and spoken word, dramatic things. I mean, they did marriages on the air here as part of their attraction. The actual information part came a little bit later, because of the resistance of the news gathering organizations to broadcast at the time.
Right.
The biggest news gathering organizations were Associated Press and United Press, and they didn't want to share their product with broadcasters yet. They were newspaper oriented.
Correct.
So any information that they did locally was what they gathered locally. They had no connection to the world. So they focused mostly on entertainment, music, people coming in. They would grab people off the street, you want to come in and play a song type of thing. I mean, it was pretty grab bag to begin with. But the real growth of the radio station began later in the 20s when the Gurney Seed and Nursery Company that was based in Yankton had an interest in it. And I think that part is interesting, is that the seed and nursery businesses in this region really helped with radio, because you had Gurney's in Yankton, and you had Earl May and Company and Henry Field and Company, both in Shenandoah, Iowa. And all three of those entities created radio stations. And some of them are still on the air today, as we are.
Okay.
And so these companies, again, they had a little difference of opinion, because the Gurneys used it just to sell Gurney products in the beginning.
Correct.
But it was a family-owned company, and like families, they had differences of opinion.
Sure.
But they're the ones that really could see how it could help their business. And they're the ones that expanded the programming, moved the studio, and actually moved the transmitter a couple times. And we can talk about the technology part of that too, which is interesting. But they're the ones that really created the demand for the radio and attached it to their business to help the radio station business grow. So it was really a dynamic industry.
Right. So what did you were on the radio for a little over 50 years.
Well, pretty close to 50.
Pretty close to 50.
49 years total in the business. Yeah.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about how you got started. I know we talked about that in our last show. Just talk just a little bit about that.
Well,
give us a background.
Since I was very young, I was interested in gizmos and stuff. And I remember my dad had in fact, I've still got a couple of tube radios, one that he won right after World War II when it was hard to get radios. He was a food salesman, and there was a contest, and he won this radio. So it's a very nice one, wood case, tube type radio, AM only.
Right.
So I used that one. And when I'm 9-10 years old, I end up stringing up 100 feet of wire in our backyard as an antenna for this radio, so I could hear distant radio stations. So for me, it started early, and I was always enthralled with the local radio stations. I grew up in Aberdeen, so the local stations there, KSDN, KABR, and I listened to those. I got to know the people on the air. I mean, they were pretty neat. And then when I'm 14 years old as a Cub Scout, we took a tour and went to KABR radio, and it was upstairs in a downtown building in Aberdeen. And I was, as I've been watching this guy, and it's one of those things that stick with you. I leaned over to see what he was doing, and I hit the tone arm on the record player on the turntable and knocked it off of his record. Needless to say, he was not happy with me, but that stuck with me. But I just thought what they were doing was very interesting, and it was something that I was interested in, and I kind of followed along. So, one thing led to another.
So define distance from one radio. How much distance did you gain by putting that cord across your lawn or across the yard?
Well, with AM radio, signals travel through the sky, and they travel some on the ground, and there's a little difference there. Well, at night, that's when you hear the distant stations, the Chicagos, the Dallases, the Little Rock stations, because of the skywave. Well, with this antenna, instead of listening to stations in northeast South Dakota, southeast North Dakota, I could hear Minnesota, Wisconsin. I could hear Nebraska. Even in the daytime, because the air was there wasn't as much interference then. But
sure,
with this long antenna in that medium range band, which is AM radio, you can hear a long ways away, because our signal isn't necessarily dictated by the horizon.
Folks, we're going to be right back with the legacy of agriculture.
Hi, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeiffers.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeiffer's. Nobody does it better.
Folks, this is Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. My guest today is Jerry Oster, returning for the second time on the Legacy of Agriculture. And we had a great first segment talking a little bit about the history of WNAX radio and inception and his beginnings into the radio industry and becoming a radio host and knowing everything about AM radio. One of the things that we talked about in the last broadcast that you were on, the last show that we were on, Jerry, was as the idea behind WNX Radio was to bring USDA reports that were current from Washington, D.C., and also as a weather channel. It was actually became, AM radio became really the only way that people knew how to get emergency weather. Explain that.
Well, in the early part of broadcast history, the Associated Press and United Press were the two major news organizations, as we mentioned, but they wouldn't share their information with broadcasters because they were newspaper-based and competition and all that.
They wanted to sell newspapers.
They wanted to sell newspapers, and they didn't want to give broadcasters a leg up because they could see what was coming. But what WNAX did, and I've seen pictures of the old Gurney building, is they installed a telegraph receiver, and they had a telegraph operator, the old dots and dashes, which is the Morse code, which is still in use, and they would get their market reports from Washington that way, and they were one of the first radio stations anywhere outside the major metro areas to have this connection, and they would get the latest USDA markets, the ag markets for livestock and for grains, and a big thing I was told back then was egg prices. Had to know what the egg prices were because there was a lot of people raising chickens apparently.
Eggs. EGGS.
Eggs. Yeah, that was a big deal. So yeah, because
why eggs?
Well, because eggs were such a commodity. I mean, that was a case where a lot of producers, a lot of farmers had a chicken coop, and the wife took care of the chicken coop, and she would take the eggs to town, and that was her grocery money. And the interesting thing is where the radio station was at 3rd and Mulberry in downtown Yankton, we had the front half of the building. The back half of the building was occupied by a company called Stoopnagels, and Stoopnagels processed eggs. They would bring in these huge boxes of eggs. They would crack them and dehydrate them, and they're the ones that ended up making it into the product for cookie dough and powdered mixes of all kinds. So they were cracking eggs in the back half of the building. And we'd get a whiff of that every now and then. So yeah, that's what I mean. That's why eggs kind of stick out to me.
It was pretty unpleasant at times.
There were days when it was, yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Those hot summer Yankton days.
Yeah, but I mean, that goes way back, and that's why eggs, that kind of stuck out in my memory because, yeah, that was a big deal, the egg prices. But, yeah, they were doing electronically and also weather reports. And basically, the Weather Bureau at that time didn't have a real quick way to transmit, so they could get some of the data through the telegraph about, okay, here's the weather, here's what's coming, here's what we expect, that kind of thing.
There was no tornado sirens. There was no way to warn people. There was no way to do it other than listening to the radio. Do you have any stories surrounding that, Jerry?
Well, in this part of the world, we have nasty weather, summer and winter, and
sure,
the ones that stick out, the blizzard of 48 was one where the trains were stuck, the drifts were huge, people couldn't get out, and the radio station was the means of communication for several weeks for a lot of people because you had the National Guard that was dropping hay in the country for livestock. You had people that were running out of milk and formula. You had people making rescues out there. So, yeah, at the time, I've heard the stories, WNAX was basically a point-to-point medium saying, well, Mrs. Jones, south of Platte, they need this. Can anybody get to them? Mr. and Mrs. Jones are on the farm 6 miles south of Platte. They need some help. That type of thing. They did those kind of communications. So, yeah, even back then it was critical.
Safety, a lot of safety, and probably the radio station probably saved a lot of lives too.
Well, you'd hope so. I mean, and the thing we go back to is we're licensed by the Federal Communications Commission, and in the license it says to serve the public interest. So that's what you try to do, and that's what we've always tried to do, I believe.
So explain an information-only station. WNX is an information-only station. Define that.
Well, when I arrived in 1976, we were playing country music.
Okay.
and we were doing news and weather and markets. But in between that, we're playing country music because that was kind of the legacy that had existed from the live music that had gone on for 50 years before that. Well, you start looking around at radio and you realize, especially on AM radio, music is not a good formula because it doesn't sound as good.
Correct.
As FM.
Correct.
So you look at that and you decide, well, what's the best thing we can do? Well, it's what we're doing right now is communicating, talking to each other ultimately. And we can only put one thing on the air at a time. So you want something that is going to keep people listening. Well, the decision was made in the early 2000s that we moved away from country music. We added a lot of talk shows, added more information, news, weather, farm, that type of stuff. So, yeah, it's a lot more intensive in terms of what you got to do because you're looking at the clock and thinking, how am I going to fill the next 15 minutes, for instance? And so you got to come up with something that people are going to listen to. And so that's where the talk shows come from and where the information comes from, and a lot of sports, too. And that's one of the reasons that we tied up with South Dakota State University as the flagship station for them, is that we wanted them on the air. They wanted us as the flagship. So there's a partnership that worked out pretty good. But that was the tilt toward information.
So tell our listeners some of your favorite experiences being a radio show for all those years, host for all those years.
The good ones
probably
the good ones are the bad ones.
You always got to go with the good ones. We got to make it look good, Jerry.
Well,
right?
When I got an Ag Award last summer, and as I was talking to the group in Huron, I told him, I said, you're looking at the last full-time reporter that's actually talked to a Democratic governor of South Dakota. And that got kind of a chuckle. That shows you how old I am. So, yeah, both Dick Knipe and Harvey Wallman in the 70s. But I was lucky with this radio station, the reach it has, and the impact it has, that I was able to talk to a lot of those people, governors, senators, representatives, legislators, and I was always interested in that type of thing. I had an early interest in news, basically because my dad had subscriptions to Minneapolis Star, the Minneapolis Tribune, the Aberdeen paper. We got Time, Newsweek, Life, Look, National Geographic. We got all those magazines at home, and I read through those all, so I always had an interest in news. But I was lucky to do that. I had great experiences. Governor George Mickelson, who was lost in the plane crash, he was wonderful. I got to fly with them to New Orleans to see the launch of the USS Rushmore, which was really a neat experience.
When was that, Jerry?
That was in the late 80s, and the USS Rushmore is an assault ship that carries 900 Marines, so that whole thing was pretty exciting. We flew in a Navy plane to New Orleans with state people. There were like 4 news people on board. I got to be one of those. Governor Mickelson was wonderful that way. In 1991, I covered the 50th anniversary of the dedication of Mount Rushmore. Got to meet Jimmy Stewart. That was pretty unique, and he was pretty much the same as you saw him on the screen. Wonderful to be around, and nice interview. It was and you got to stop. And it was like, wow, this is Jimmy Stewart. That type of thing.
That's a big deal.
Well, I'm doing my job, but then you also got to stop and separate a little bit. Like, wow, this is Jimmy Stewart. And he's a great guy. He was wonderful because they put on a presentation at the amphitheater at the base of Mount Rushmore. So
sure,
and that was a trip in '91.
In interviewing you, I can always tell when somebody really enjoys their job, but I could tell that you didn't go to work very often, that you really liked your job and you liked what you were doing.
Well, yeah, and the thing I liked about it is that I came in every morning at 4 a.m., which I always like because there's no traffic, right? So
yeah, that's right. Yeah. You got to make the tracks in the snow.
There were times like that, but I would come in and I'd have an idea. Okay, I'm going to do this, this, and this today. But then by 6 a.m. it all changed because something came up, and I always liked that spontaneity that we could do stuff like that. And I also had the attitude: if I'm up at 6 a.m., I'm going to call you because you can get up too. So,
that's right. You might as well wake up to me, right?
I did that more than once, but over the years, people were very gracious. I got to say, I kind of perfected my own style, which I call being pleasantly obnoxious. And it must have worked because I didn't get hung up on a whole lot in my career. So it was good. But no, I enjoyed it. Radio was good. Radio was good to me and my family. I met my wife at the radio station.
Very good.
Yeah. So what can I say? I can't complain.
Folks, we're coming down to the end of our second segment of the Legacy of Agriculture. My guest on today is Jerry Oster, and we're going to be right back with our third segment.
Hi, this is Jasmine at Piper's Auction Realty and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeifers.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeifers. Nobody does it better.
Good morning, everybody. This is Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. My guest, Jerry Oster from WNAX Radio, retired, I might say, and enjoying some freedom. Had a great segment number 1 and a great segment number 2. I want to talk a little bit about the personalities that you have encountered over your almost 50 years of being on the radio.
Well, the personalities here at WNAX were amazing. When I got here, I was a 23-year-old kid, and I was amazed. We had Bob Hill was the news director, and he'd been here since the 40s. Norm Hilson was a sports director, legendary Norm, and he'd been here since the mid-50s. Ed Nelson was in the farm department. He'd been here since the early 50s. And Wynn Speece had come back, your neighbor lady, and she'd been here since the 30s. So, I mean, it was really stunning to me, these people with all the talent that were at the radio station. I got to work with Norm directly in 1979 because Tom Maxwell, who was another great personality we had, who's passed on, left the radio station, and Norm had been doing South Dakota State football. And so Norm asked me if I'd want to join him as the color guy for South Dakota State. So I was like, wow, sure. So in the fall of 79, I joined him, and I did color for South Dakota State for the next 30 years after that. So even after Norm passed on, unfortunately. But he was such a colorful guy. The boss at the time said, if we ever had a problem where the only thing we had was a microphone into the transmitter, I'd give it to Norm and we'd be okay, because he could carry on a broadcast like nobody I've ever met.
It goes on and on and on.
Yeah, he was full of it, and I mean, he was such a talent. He and Wynn worked together in what they called Holiday Inn for the holiday program for years. He was a personality who went out as an announcer doing remotes. He talked about one summer he and Wynn toured most of eastern South Dakota with a 50-pound block of cheese in the back of the car, which by the end of the tour was becoming a ripe block of cheese. Radio.
Green block of cheese.
Yeah, it was getting there. So and things like that. So, and we had so much fun on the road. It was amazing because he knew everybody in the old North Central Conference, which was, of course, South Dakota State, USD, North Dakota State, North Dakota, St. Cloud, Mankato, Morningside, all those, Augustana, all those schools. And he knew everybody, and everybody knew him. And it was amazing to be on the road with him and that type of thing. We'd go out for a beer before the game, and it would be your turn, my turn, time to go. Norm was a little tight, so he was known to be tight. So yeah, he was great. Wynn Speece was cheap, tight, economical. And Wynn Speece, your neighbor lady, what a wonderful talent. I mean, she could talk to people like nobody else, and her claim to fame was in those years, the 40s into the 50s, for a lot of the farm women out there. This is the only female voice they heard all week, because their husband's out working, they're home with the kids, and they didn't get out as much.
And it was a male-dominated business, the radio business.
Yeah,
was.
And to have this female on the air and what she was doing was amazing. I mean, she had at one time 4 ladies working for her just doing mail. She was getting 800,000 pieces of mail a year. And
wow.
They were selling everything from cookbooks to chickens to you name it, and she could do it. She was a salesperson. One of the best stories she ever told me, and with Wynn, I got to believe your neighbor lady wouldn't lie to me.
Right.
But she also helped the radio station sell, and so they
sure.
And it was close to Thanksgiving. They flew in a small plane, 4 of them, to Minneapolis, pilot and 3 from the station, to meet with national representatives. It was a big deal.
Okay.
So she went up there to help sell the program and sell the radio station, and they got done, and they headed back toward Yankton, and it was rain and snow, and that typical November weather, and the plane started to ice up.
Oh, no.
Yeah, exactly. And the pilot finally says, we got to land. So he dips out of the clouds. They're over southwest Minnesota somewhere, and he lands on a gravel road.
Wow.
And she's telling me the story, and I'm thinking, sure. So anyway, he taxis his plane up the road, and he finds a farm. And he pulls into the farmyard. And first of all, the farmer had to look at like an airplane. So they get parked and explain it to him. And the guy's like, yeah, come on in. So here they come in the house. And here's a woman and her kids. And the farm wife looks at her and realizes, oh, my gosh, it's the neighbor lady at my house. She said that poor woman turned about 3 shades of white when she realized, and they ended up spending the night at the farmhouse. And this poor woman, your neighbor, it's like Oprah coming to your house,
Right.
and you're going to start cleaning up, right?
Right.
So, yeah, Wynn said that was amazing. That, that's one of her best stories. And again, I can't believe your neighbor lady would lie to me. So she was, and she had a ton of that stuff. But I mean, just personalities like that at this radio station was amazing.
Tell us a little bit about the famous Lawrence Welk.
Well, Lawrence Welk was his band from North Dakota. And they were coming through town, and they stayed here. They played a dance, and he walked down to the radio station and talked to Chan Gurney, later became a senator, one of the Gurney family members. He was running the station at the time, and Chan said, listen to his story about his band, and he says, sure, I'll put you on the radio. I'm not going to pay you, but you can come on and play for free, which is typical for radio. And so Lawrence did, and what he did from there was he would book dances, say, hey, we're available for dances. And so they would get paid to go out and play these dances around the area. And that's how he kind of got his start in terms of making a band, making a name for himself. And also, Fern, his wife, was from Yankton. He met her here.
Right.
So
Lawrence Welk's wife was actually working the front desk, wasn't she?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
That's where he met her. And he was kind enough in later years, if you look at his programs, there's several times when he'd do a retrospective and he'd have WNAX on the microphones on his show. So, apparently there were some good memories here, which is good. So, yeah, he did okay after he left here. He was off to Chicago and off to the big time.
That's amazing.
Yep.
That's one thing that I've always enjoyed about the auction industry that I've been in is you just never know who you're going to come across. You never know who you're going to meet.
Exactly.
And once you meet them and once you get to know them, sometimes those relationships last an entire lifetime, and you never forget some people.
Oh, no. Yeah, it's wonderful. And I've met so many people through this, and we'll be out somewhere with my wife now and somebody say hi to me and she'll say, who's that? And it's like, I don't know. I met him somewhere along the way, You try to be kind.
You recognize the face, but you can't remember the name.
Well, a lot of times I talk to people and, I've not met them in person. And that's the thing. There are people I talked to over the years on the phone that I never met in person, but I consider them friends, that type of thing. So, yeah. I mean, it's like your industry. It's amazing that way. It's people-based. And, yeah, I always enjoyed that part.
Folks, we're coming down to the end of our third segment of the Legacy of Agriculture. Jerry Oster is my guest, and we're going to be right back in just a few minutes. But I want to talk a little bit about our sponsor, Pfeiffer Auction and Realty. For a complete listing of all of the auctions that we've got coming into 2025, you'll want to go to our website at Pfeiffers.com. That's Pifers.com, or simply call us 605-836-2277. Nobody does it better.
Hey, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeiffers.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeiffer's. Nobody does it better.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're coming into our fourth and final segment of the Legacy of Agriculture. We're well into wintertime, Jerry. It's December here in South Dakota, and it came with a vengeance and single digits and snow.
Well, I bought a new snowblower, so that means I won't need it, right?
That's right.
I hope not, yeah.
That means it won't snow.
Yeah, that'd be fine by me.
That means.
Yeah.
In this segment, Jerry, I want to talk a lot of, I really want to spend some time and talk about the technology, because 102 years ago, in WNAX's inception, technology was extremely simple. Now, technology, just take a look at the cell phones. It took me 10 minutes to find the timer on my cell phone so I could do these segments, right? I got a computer over there laying on the corner that I didn't plug in last night, so I can't make it go.
Yep.
So,
but somehow we're struggling through.
That's right. We'll make it. So tell us about the technology and how technology has driven the radio industry over the years.
Well, yeah, you think back 102 years ago, the first radio station, Dakota radio apparatus, They started with about a 100, 200 watt transmitter. It was all tube type, pretty much homemade, pretty much home built. They didn't really have off the rack type of equipment there. They had a microphone. They figured out a way to play actually a record player with the big horn type of thing into a microphone, which, the technology at the time, that worked pretty good. And even at 200 watts, since there was nothing else on the air, it could be heard over quite a long distance. So they started about 200 watts. Later in the 20s, after the Gurneys got it, they bumped it to 250 watts. And actually, the radio station was on about 1220 on the AM band. They later moved down to 570, which is an advantage, and I'll talk about that here in a sec. So the Gurneys moved it from there. They then moved it to the Gurney building, which is still in downtown Yankton, close to the river. They put up 2 basic windmill towers and ran a long wire between that as their antenna at about 500 watts. Okay, well, Suddenly your coverage is getting bigger and bigger.
Doubled up.
Yep. Well, later in the 30s, they made a major decision, and they bought 60 acres of land about 5 miles northeast of Yankton near Mission Hill. They built the building, which is still there. It's kind of an Art Deco, mid-30s type structure, stucco. And they installed a 5,000-watt transmitter, which was a huge bump. They built a 440-foot tower, self-supporting, 4-legged tower. It was a beautiful tower. And with 5,000 watts, suddenly they're getting letters from Louisiana.
Really?
Yeah, places Louisiana, Mississippi, the people are hearing them. Like, this is a pretty big deal. And so that transmitter, they bought a Western Electric used transmitter. It was water cooled, and I was the last one to run it in 1978 before we took it out. And you had to be Casey Jones and the Wizard of Oz to run this thing, seriously, because it's water cooled. So you got water circulating through this transmitter, and there's all kinds of dynamos in the back room that are spinning. It was incredible. I mean, it was like, for me, I'd come out of Lake Area Tech, so I was a tech guy. We were working with I worked with vacuum tubes, but transistors and that type of thing. This thing is a monster. It took up half of the room out there, and the water cooled the transmitter, but the only water you could use was distilled water.
Okay.
Because anything out of the tap would conduct electricity. Distilled water won't. So
creates all kinds of problems.
Right. So it had to be distilled water and these tubes, and it was like, holy cow. So they installed that when they moved in 1936. In 1948, they installed a General Electric, which took up part of the other wall, and we ran that. That was our main transmitter when I got here.
Okay.
And that was built like a tank. That was a battleship. That was pretty good. Although the engineers at the time said, yeah, GE builds good toasters, but not so much transmitters because it took a lot of work.
Correct.
And then after that, we moved into the more solid state. In 78, we installed our first modern transmitter. And then after that, and that got smaller and smaller because instead of taking up the size of a wall, they're now about the size of a refrigerator. Okay. Still 5,000 watts, solid state. We went away from tubes to all solid state devices, transistors that drive 5,000 watts, and they run cool. The efficiency is so much better. We probably run on 1/10 of the electricity that it took to run the old ones.
Correct.
I mean, that's the efficiency part of it. On the studio side, we went from big tube-driven hot boards to these small. Now, these are all digital boards. Well, analog digital. Digital is cleaner because all it is data.
Correct.
There's not other stuff that enters into it, and there's a different technology and much easier to install. It's like one wire now instead of miles and miles of wire, like when we built this studio. So that part, the technology changed there, became much more efficient, much cleaner, much simpler, and it's all, as you found out, computer connected. So
correct.
You got to boot them up every day.
Yeah, that's right.
And same thing on the air. We haven't put a record, tape, or CD on the air in 15, 18 years. It's all digital audio that goes through the computer. Everything's on the computer. And for me, I'd much rather do it that way than working with tape or anything like that. So
I imagine that became a real fiasco trying to keep tape going and records clean and organized. And
yeah, with anything that is handled a lot, and yeah, tape is fragile, records are fragile, they get scratched, they get messy, that type of thing. So the editing part, like we're doing here, as this program is being recorded on a computer, much easier to edit, much easier to handle, much easier to store, much easier to move around, as you know. So
I watched Jim do some editing the other day, and he can edit a show in about 5 minutes. Just click by watching the screen and seeing where we're at, the timer and the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
Well, Jerry, we're coming down to about 2.5 minutes. Tell us some of your favorite experiences, maybe not stories, but your favorite experiences outside of people. You talked a lot about people.
Well, I guess one of my favorites was earlier in 2024, I got to go to Frisco, Texas, and watch the South Dakota State Jackrabbits win their second national championship football. That was a lot of fun.
Right.
Having been with the program for so long and knowing the people there, that was a pretty good experience, I got to say. Like I said, the 91 dedication of Mount Rushmore rededication, that was neat. President Bush was there, and again, get to meet people out there. Those type of experiences that I was fortunate enough to be able to do through the radio station, and just really being on the air and talking to so many great people every day and hearing about it. You'd get surprised every now and then somebody would comment in a store or something that they really liked what you did, and that's why I was here. That's at least, as Coach Stiglmeyer always said, make a difference. You mad, make a difference, and you try to do that every day, make a difference. So
it's interesting. You talk a little bit about that. The other day, I was doing a radio show privately in a conference room, and I was having an idle conversation with a couple of gentlemen, and a guy poked his head in and he says, "I recognize your voice. You're on WNAX radio at 10 o'clock in the morning." And I go, "I sure am." And he says, "Keep doing what you're doing."
Well, there you see. Exactly. Right. That's a neat feeling, isn't it?
Yeah, it makes you feel good. Makes you feel like you're doing something important. Well, in the last 30 seconds are here, Jerry, what would you like to say to our listening audience?
Well, just keep listening, please, first of all, and we appreciate everybody that's out there. And, on behalf of WNAX, we'll continue to try to do what we can to keep our people connected. I mean, the next few years look to be interesting, to say the least, so stay tuned.
I can't say enough thanks to you, Jerry, for joining us again the second time. I got a feeling we're going to be back probably in about a year for another one.
All right.
We're going to find out what you learned in a whole year. But, folks, this is Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. We're going to be finishing up this show, and we want to thank our sponsor, Pfeiffer Auction and Realty. We'll be back next week.
In it here now, I'm gonna do now. I'm gonna been on here now. Who bid $500,000 bid?
We hope you've enjoyed today's edition of The Legacy of Agriculture with Chris Bair, sponsored by Pfeiffer's Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Call Pfeiffer's at 605-836-2277.